Picture this. You park as close to the entrance as you possibly can. You circle the lot twice, looking for that one spot 15 steps closer to the door. You don't need to. You're not injured. You're not carrying anything. You're not even in a hurry. Some part of your brain just made that call before you consciously noticed there was a call to make. And a few seconds later, a small wave of guilt shows up. I really should walk more. I should use that gym membership. I should be one of those people who takes the stairs. Here's the thing nobody says out loud. That instinct to avoid the extra 15 steps isn't a personal failing. It's not laziness, and it's not a lack of willpower. It is, almost word for word, the same decision every single one of your ancestors made for roughly 2 million years, and they made it without an ounce of shame. Harvard evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman has built much of his career around a single, deceptively simple claim. Exercise. Physical activity performed voluntarily for health with no other purpose is a modern invention. It doesn't show up in the archaeological record. It doesn't show up in the handful of hunter-gatherer societies still living something close to a pre-agricultural life today. For nearly the entire span of human existence, nobody ever worked out. That's not because early humans were unmotivated. It's because in a world where you genuinely don't know where your next meal is coming from, burning calories on purpose for no immediate payoff is a bizarre thing to do. Lieberman has put it bluntly in his writing and lectures. Our default setting isn't to move, it's to conserve. The people we call lazy today are, in his words, doing exactly what natural selection built them to do. And this didn't start with us. A 2016 study in Nature tracking wild chimpanzees found they spend somewhere around 10.5 hours of every 12-hour day essentially resting. Our closest living relatives evolved in resource-tight forest environments where doing less meant surviving longer. When our ancestors' lineage split off and moved onto the open grasslands of East Africa roughly 7 million years ago, walking upright made long-distance movement cheaper. But the underlying preference for rest, whenever rest was affordable, didn't disappear. It just got inherited. So, did ancient humans actually move a lot? Yes, just not in the way fitness culture imagines. Anthropologist David Reichlin at the University of Arizona has spent years strapping GPS units and accelerometers onto members of the Hadza, one of the last populations on Earth still living primarily by hunting and gathering. His data shows Hadza men cover roughly 8 to 11 miles on an average day. Hadza women cover about 4 to 6. Those numbers sound enormous by modern standards. But every mile of it had a job attached. Walking toward water, tracking game, hauling firewood, carrying a child on a hip. There was no lap around the block for its own sake. Reichlin's summary of the pattern is worth repeating. The Hadza move when there's a reason to move, and the instant the reason disappears, they stop and rest. Not out of exhaustion, not out of avoidance, just because there's nothing left to accomplish by continuing. And rest, in that world, didn't look like a recliner and a screen. It looked like sitting cross-legged on open ground, which demands constant small muscular adjustments just to stay upright. It looked like grooming, storytelling, repairing a tool, shifting position every few minutes because there was no chair engineered to eliminate that need. Researchers studying the physiology of sitting have found that it's not stillness itself that damages metabolic health. It's uninterrupted stillness. Hunter-gatherer rest, almost by accident of circumstance, was full of exactly the kind of small interruptions modern furniture and modern jobs have engineered out of existence. In 2012, biological anthropologist Herman Ponzer, then at Hunter College and now at Duke, ran a study that should have upended the entire conversation about exercise and weight. Working with colleagues, he measured the total daily energy expenditure of Hadza adults using the doubly labeled water method, the gold standard for tracking real calorie burn, and compared it to sedentary adults in the United States and Europe. The assumption going in was obvious. People walking 8+ miles a day through the savannah must torch dramatically more calories than someone who drives to an office and sits for 8 hours. The result, published in PLOS One, said otherwise. Once you controlled for body size, Hadza adults burned roughly the same number of total calories per day as their Western, largely sedentary counterparts. Ponser's explanation, which he's since expanded into what he calls the constrained energy expenditure model, is that the body doesn't simply add activity calories on top of a fixed baseline. When physical demand goes up, the body appears to dial down energy spent elsewhere, on inflammation, stress hormone signaling, even reproductive function, to keep total output within a fairly narrow range. Sit all day instead, and that saved energy doesn't vanish. It seems to get redirected into processes that, over a lifetime, aren't necessarily good for you. This doesn't mean movement is irrelevant to health. Hadza cardiovascular markers are dramatically better than age-matched Americans on nearly every measure Reichlen and Ponser have tracked. It means the story is more complicated than they burn more, so they're healthier. A related study of the Tsimane, a forager horticulturalist population in the Bolivian Amazon, studied by Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan, found some of the lowest rates of coronary artery disease ever recorded in a human population. Most Tsimane in their 70s had arteries that looked, on imaging, like those of an American in their 50s. None of these populations were training for anything, and yet the physical evidence of their bodies tells a striking story. A 2017 study out of Cambridge, led by anthropologist Alison McIntosh, examined the arm bones of Neolithic farming women and found bone strength that exceeded that of current Cambridge University rowers, women who train competitively multiple hours a day. The Neolithic women weren't lifting weights. They were grinding grain by hand for hours, for years, because that's what turning wheat into flour required. There's a similarly striking data point closer to home. In the early 2000s, exercise physiologist David Bassett studied old order Amish communities in Ontario, who still farm largely without engine-powered equipment. Using pedometers, his team found Amish men were averaging around 18,000 steps a day, and Amish women around 14,000, several times the modern American average, with obesity rates in the low single digits. Again, nobody there considered it exercise. It was just what the day required. The pattern repeats everywhere researchers have looked. Fitness wasn't a goal anyone was pursuing. It was the unavoidable physical residue of a life that couldn't be lived without effort. The moment that requirement gets engineered out, tractors instead of grinding stones, cars instead of miles on foot, the fitness leaves with it. Not because anyone got weaker-willed, but because the body has always been extremely good at not doing more than it has to. This is where the evolutionary story stops being trivia and starts being relevant to the leading causes of death in the developed world. Lieberman has a specific term for conditions like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. Diseases of comfort. Not diseases of laziness, not diseases of moral failure. Diseases of mismatch. Produced when a body calibrated by millions of years of near-constant low-level physical demand is placed somewhere that has quietly removed almost all of it. And the research increasingly points to a specific culprit within that mismatch. It's not primarily about missing high-intensity workouts. It's about the disappearance of what physiologists call NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. The background hum of standing, walking, fidgeting, and shifting that used to fill nearly every waking hour before elevators, remote controls, and food delivery apps quietly removed the need for it. Physiologist James Levine, who coined the term while at the Mayo Clinic, found that this baseline movement can vary by hundreds of calories a day between two people of similar size and diet, and that its disappearance tracks closely with the rise in obesity rates over the last half-century. Nobody engineered the escalator, the office chair, or the drive-thru to make people sick. Each one solved a narrow, real problem: getting somewhere faster, sitting more comfortably, eating without leaving the car. But stack 10,000 of those small conveniences on top of each other, and the aggregate effect is a body that spends its day almost entirely below the activity threshold it was built to expect. The point of all this isn't to tell you that exercise doesn't matter. The evidence for regular physical activity's benefits, on its own terms, is about as solid as anything in medicine. The point is to take the guilt out of the equation, because that guilt is doing almost no useful work. Lieberman's own argument here is pointed. The fitness industry took a real, well-supported health need and wrapped it in a moral framework. The idea that skipping a workout says something about your character. And that framework hasn't actually produced a more active population. What it has produced is a cycle of guilt, short bursts of overambitious effort, and burnout, repeating indefinitely. Nobody in Hadza camp is praised for hitting a step count. Nobody in a Neolithic village got a trophy for grip strength. Movement simply happened because the day required it, and rest happened just as naturally when it didn't. The most useful move you can make with this information probably isn't finding more willpower. It's finding ways to make some version of that unavoidable, low-stakes daily movement quietly built back into how you already live. Not because your worth depends on it, but because your body, the one you actually have, was built to run on it. It just won't ask you for it out loud. It never has.